Hey everyone, this is May. Welcome to another episode of the May Lee Show. We are still going through some trying times, and even more trying times, I should say. First it was COVID-19, which we're still struggling with, of course. And then the George Floyd murder happened, and then the aftermath of it. We're witnessing, we're experiencing, we're involved with the rage and the horror that we're all experiencing, the fear, the confusion, and sometimes feeling of hopelessness. But then on the opposite side, feelings of hope that maybe finally things are going to change. So again, this is beyond a perfect storm now of what's happening. We have everything from social unrest, economic uncertainty, political division, cultural divide. So it is as if everything is happening at once. And it's no one is untouched by all of what's happening. There's no way you can be unscathed by what has been happening this year, 2020. So I really wanted to do an episode to speak to somebody who may help us understand to a certain extent from a spiritual point of view, but also from a very realistic social point of view, and to just give us some words of wisdom, guidance, and hope, but also be very realistic. And I was thinking, gosh, who do I know? Who do I respect who could help me have a conversation about this in a understandable way that tries to be as objective but also as genuine and authentic as possible. And I thought of somebody who I had interviewed several years ago when I was doing a different show called Full Frame. And so he was one of my guests because of his advocacy work towards hunger. But he's also a pastor, and he's Korean American. And his name is Pastor Eugene Cho. Some of you may know who he is. He actually is quite well known, and he is somebody who has been very involved in not just spiritual work, but also advocacy and trying to eradicate global poverty and especially hunger. But his background is that he's the founder and the former senior pastor of Quest Church. He was there for 18 years up in Seattle, and he's still based up there. But then he left the church and he founded a group called One Day's Wages, and that's when I was interviewing him. It's a grassroots organization that helps try and alleviate poverty and hunger around the world, and it's a pretty simple idea. It's the idea that you just give 1 day's worth of your wages to help alleviate hunger. And so he started that. And now he's the president-elect of Bread for the World. I had never heard of this group until, I spoke to Eugene, a nonpartisan Christian advocacy organization urging both national and global decision makers to help end hunger both in the U.S. and around the world. And Eugene has also published a book called, I love this title, Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk, A Christian's Guide to Engaging Politics. Pretty timely, I think. And he felt compelled to write this book because of, what we're seeing, the divisiveness, and the hatred that we're seeing now because of politics. He also wrote a book several years ago called Overrated, Are We More in Love with the Idea of Changing the World Than Actually Changing the World? So you can clearly see by his background and obviously what he writes about that he cares about realistic issues and problems, but also bringing it to a spiritual level as well. And honestly, as somebody, I myself, I have faith. I'm a Christian, but I'm also a realist, and I'm also progressive. And I just feel like from that perspective, we do need to look at the world not just behind church doors or sanctuary doors or synagogue or temple. We have to really try to apply, what we believe in our hearts, whether that comes from your faith or just your moral standing, your moral compass. We have to approach things realistically in how we apply. If you really believe these things that come from wherever to do good, then we need to know how to realistically apply it, especially now when there's so much going on and so much ill in the world. So, Pastor Eugene Cho very graciously said yes to an interview, even though he is crazy busy right now trying to prepare for his new role. So he joins me now from Seattle. Pastor Cho, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to see you.
Thank you again so much for having me, May.
Well, these, like I said just a minute ago, these are such trying times that we're in. It feels like the world is coming to an end. I mean, it's one thing after another. It's on top of each other. The COVID crisis, then George Floyd's murder, and it's just this unrest and unease that we're all feeling. First, tell me how you are feeling about what's going on right now.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And I think I almost chuckled when you asked this question, because there are times I find myself crying, chuckling, shaking my head. It's all of the above. It's the entire spectrum of human emotions.
Right.
And it's not just global news. It's not just national news. There are things that we're experiencing in our respective cities and neighborhoods. And then obviously in our own personal lives, in our families, with our children, our parents, and the list goes on.
Right.
So if I'm being perfectly honest, I know that sometimes as a minister or a pastor, I'm supposed to remain composed, to always remain hopeful. But I think it's also really important for us to be present and to lament and to grieve and to mourn. And I say that not just as a Christian, but even as a Korean American or an Asian American, where sometimes, I don't want to make a sweeping generalization, but I think sometimes we've experienced that in our culture, we're supposed to kind of repress, hold within our hearts, our emotions.
Right.
And I think this is really important for us to be vulnerable and to name some of the grieving and the mourning that we're all experiencing right now.
I'm glad you brought that up about how Asians tend to sometimes deal with challenges in their lives where, the natural thing to do when you're Asian is to internalize and to just kind of power on
That's right.
with a brave face, right?
Right.
And so this is a time when even Asians, because of COVID-19, have been challenged due to the rise in xenophobia and racism, right?
Absolutely. I don't know how many weeks ago this happened, but some weeks ago I wrote as best as I could, a politeful but firm response to President Donald Trump's tweet about calling COVID-19 coronavirus Chinese virus.
Right.
It went viral. Did an interview with Washington Post. That article got cross-circulated in about 20 newspapers around the world. And initially, I felt like I needed to speak up because this was impacting so many people. It wasn't just sparse news, but even at that time, hundreds, thousands of Asians here in this country and around the world had been impacted by physical or verbal assault and abuse. And
still are. And still are.
Yeah, absolutely. It is ongoing. And I think it's been obviously lost in the shuffle of so much that's going on, and we need to name it. But I think you've acknowledged and named the fact that it's not just the global pandemic over there. It's literally impacting our bodies. And so we're not just worried about the actual possibility of the virus, but there's also something incredibly painful and hurtful, toxic, when your very existence is being threatened, if you will, and we're being insulted and assaulted. And I think in some ways, this is the reason why when Asians are confronted by the news of George Floyd, we can't be passive bystanders.
Yes.
Even if there are complexities in our relationships with other minority groups, we cannot be on the sidelines.
Yes, Pastor Cho, I've been saying to my audience, and I recently did a video also regarding the George Floyd case and the protests, saying that because Asians ourselves have just recently been dealing with this kind of racism, this overt racism, and creating this fear in us, wondering, are we going to be attacked? What's going to happen when we walk outside? We have to have even more empathy for the African American community that's been dealing with this for 400 years, right?
Yeah.
So it is that idea of solidarity that I, really want to push within our own communities, and people of color have to come together to fight this serious disease of racism that is so pervasive.
Yeah, you speak to any Asian American, we all know that racism exists. We know that we've experienced it. But in the last 4 or 5 months, I think we've experienced it in a way that has completely crushed any sort of semblance, imagination. Some of us may have thought, hey, we're in, we're fully accepted.
Right.
We're doctors and lawyers. And that's a myth, and I'm not here to vilify white America, but I am here to vilify white supremacy and racism. And I think we can name that. And, and as you noted, when we are hearing stories of our Black and brown sisters and brothers right now, it's the weight of the constant anxiety and fear that you walk around with. And you're right, in the last few months, every time my kids go out, the first thing that my wife and I say is, hey, please be careful. Yep. We've never said that at every single conversation, but it has been the last thing that we say before they walk out the doors. After we say, we love you, now please be careful.
Right.
And so your word about solidarity, that we have to stand in shoulders, be on our knees, we need to speak up. And again, I want to be careful about some of these sweeping generalizations, but Asians typically have been said to be a bit passive when it comes to these sorts of things.
Yep.
And I think there is some sort of legitimacy to that. And so we have to not just allow the few Asian Americans to speak up. We have to all raise our voices to be a choir of justice and solidarity.
And thank you for saying that, Pastor Cho, because I have been saying that over and over again on my show. The good news is that I do see a movement taking place that's broader now. And maybe the George Floyd incident also elevated that even more. And brought it to the focus, brought it to our consciousnness even more. And so my question to you, from a faith perspective, but also just a human perspective, is this an awakening for all of us? Is this what we needed? And I was having a conversation with somebody just last night. I said, maybe we needed something so catastrophic, so earth-shattering, that impacted every single one of us, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what your background, to finally awaken us all to the ills of the world and not choose to continue to ignore it because we were greedy or selfish, or we wanted, just to keep going and ignoring the true problems that exist. What are your thoughts on that?
I want to say yes, and I want to believe yes, but I think we have to also just acknowledge that in our cultural context, we live in a very much of a microwave generation. We live in a very short attention span generation. So there is certainly a struggle. There's a tuggle going on. But I think, having said that, there is something going on. I often hear people of all ages, particularly people that are millennials or even boomers or people of all ages, we speak with lots of wonder about the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Words like, man, if I was alive during that time. And I don't want to take anything away from the significance of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. But what I do want to tell people is that there is a movement happening right now. And we're alive. And the question is, are we going to be engaged? And it doesn't mean that we have to stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to give a speech. But I think every single one of us, we need to ask, how do I contribute to this movement of justice, movement of a national consciousness, if you will? So I want to believe, and I work to believe that there is something significant going on.
Yeah, I mean, you see it. At least I feel like I see it now more than ever. These obviously people are protesting and marching everywhere, trying to do it peacefully. But at times it becomes violent, and I think that's human nature. But also, there's political reasons for that too. We're going to get to that in a second. But
Sure.
But it does seem like this time people are calling this a tipping point of some sort. That it's hit the brink, and so now we're finally cracking it open wide. Again, to see the true ugliness of what maybe has been covered for a long time and ignored. Let's hope, right? I mean, we can only hope that that's what's happening. But in terms of action, what do you think we need to do then? What should we be doing? What should we be considering as a human being? Because a lot of folks, sometimes I still hear this, I don't know if I can make a difference.
Yeah. No, I think sometimes the news can be so overwhelming, right? And I actually think that we need to make sure that we disconnect a little bit to process what we're seeing, what we're hearing. We need to process some of the conversations. Our minds and our hearts don't have the capacity to process and computate all of these things. Yeah. So having said that, that's not permission to disengage and to detach, but I think to recalibrate, if you will. But there's a few things that I would say all of us should be doing on some way or the other. The first one is to really make sure that we engage in the important work of empathy. Because it's not just like legal work or advocacy work, but we have to make sure that there's something within our hearts that's stirred and disrupted in some ways. Yeah. And if this time right now feels really jarring, that's actually a good thing. We should be jarred. We should be shaken. Yes. It's not something that should just pass, and it's a kind of a nebulous academic engagement. Our literal souls and bodies should be shaken. Right. So as we empathize, we grieve with people, we mourn with people, we lament with people, we listen. And as we do that, I think there's something about we learn and then we leverage. How do we leverage the information, the stories that we have? And I would say three very practical things that I can suggest to people is that we need to make sure our voices are heard through the work of advocacy. We're calling our lawmakers. Yes. We're writing letters. We're engaging in conversations to say enough is enough. We need reform on this particular matter. Starting on July, I'll be entering into a new role as president of Bread for the World. And our entire work is around advocacy. And it's stunning to think that as a result of COVID, we're going to see likely a 60% increase of children going hungry here in the United States. Many of them are Black and brown children. And so we've got to connect the dots and say, okay, if we're advocating for the dignity of Black and brown communities, we also need to ensure that nutrition and hunger and flourishing is also possible for them as it is for us as well. So that would be the first one. I think the second thing that I would say is that we need to have the hard conversations. And it's not just with them. Sometimes when we talk about these issues, we're talking about them. I'm talking about in our own house, around our dining table, with our parents, with our children. We have to be wise about this. I'm not suggesting that we're swearing off our parents, but I'm saying with wisdom, because we love our own culture as well. And as we've experienced racism in our culture, we need to have the courage to be introspective and say, hey, we also have tendencies that are racist towards others as well, including other minority groups. Right. And the third thing that I would say is to be prepared for the marathon, that we got to be continuing to learn, because the word that you use is movement as opposed to a moment. That's the conversation that people are having right now. Is this a moment?
For sure.
Or is this a movement? And I think it's the latter. Yeah. So we've got to learn to be in it for the long haul.
Right. We have to sustain it. There has to be some sustainability with the movement. But you touched upon a subject that comes up fairly often and more often now because of what's been happening with the racism against Asians and the ongoing racism against African Americans, that we all have to do some self-reflection and self-assessment as well in terms of our own prejudices and biases, right? And, and I call it out too, within the Asian community, there is racism. Yep. Asians have been known to be racist, and that's why there is this clash between people of color. African-American community, Asian community. So that's something that we really need to take a harder look at and somehow heal, or at least have more conversations about.
Yeah. No, I think that in itself would be a great extended podcast and conversation that we could have with numerous people. Yeah. I think right now we've got to lean in, listen to our Black and brown sisters and brothers. We need to make sure that our parents and our communities are safe because of COVID. But the reality of racism and prejudice, again, not to take away from what's going on right now, it exists in all people, in all people groups. And again, the natural inclination, the easy thing to do is to point the finger at others. Yes. And we need to do some more examination of ourselves. Right. I think the relationship with African Americans and Koreans and with Asian Americans, it's complex.
It is.
There's a lot of nuance. And sometimes I think that there's two camps that I worry about in this conversation, if I can just talk about that briefly.
Yes, please.
I'm worried about those who just deny it, that it doesn't exist, everything is good, Koreans and Asians aren't racist, there's no ill will whatsoever. And that's just being naive, and it's not helpful at all.
Right.
I also think that there are folks that would simply, including among Asian Americans, who don't understand the complexities and nuances of why Asian Americans harbor some pain in our relationship with African Americans. Yeah. So we've got to kind of dig into some of that nuance. When you look at the LA riots, for example.
Yep, perfect example.
We've got to name, obviously, the horrific shooting that took place where a 16-year-old African American girl was shot in the back by a Korean grocery market owner. Mm-hmm. But having said that, we have to also acknowledge that, yes, while you have Asian and Korean businesses that have been in these Black neighborhoods, that there's also been some difficult relationships that have gone both ways that have fueled not coalition, not flourishing, not friendship, but oftentimes it's become more transactional than relational.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think there's just so much that we can speak into this. But right now, this is the time when we can have some of those conversations and say, we're not in competition with each other. We've got to be in coalition with one another to battle this incredible epidemic called racism.
Yes, yes. And I just said this the other day where it's not a suffering competition. It's not about who's suffering most. It's not a race Olympics where, there's a winner, there's a loser. Because we have to look at just the root of the problem, which is overt racism, across the board. And you're right. I mean, it's such a complex issue when you break it down within communities of color. And especially the Asian African American relationship. So you're right. Actually, Pastor Cho, we should do an entire podcast, a town hall type of thing to talk about this, because I think this is something that comes up constantly. Even with my viewers, they send me messages via Instagram and Twitter when I post something, and they're like, "Well, what about us? The African American community didn't help us when we were struggling." So there's a lot of this, still this conflict and animosity that we need to work on.
Absolutely. We just haven't had those deep conversations. No. I think we've had conversations within our own enclaves.
Yes.
And so it's kind of our version of our echo chambers. And so certain stereotypes gets perpetuated again and again. So when we're speaking about some of those grocery stores in these African-American communities, perhaps in African-American conversations, it's always like, hey, these Asians, they take from our neighborhood and they don't give back.
Yeah.
I know that to be partly true, but not entirely true.
Yeah.
And then similarly, you have grocery store owners that have experienced abuse and sometimes physical assault.
Yes.
Has that happened? Yes. Is that the entirety of the relationship with our African American neighbors? Absolutely not.
Right.
But in our little echo chambers, that's the only story or the majority of the story. And after a while, it just gets elevated. And so we need to tell a better story, a deeper story, and a more hopeful story about the future as well.
Right, right. We have to change the narrative, because if it's just controlled by one incident or a couple of incidents, then of course that is going to become the narrative that represents all of us, when it's indeed not the case. Pastor Cho, I think I now want to ask you more of a faith question or spirituality question. Do you think, because of what's happening, and again, we're seeing such ugliness in the world, have we lost our sense of morality, civility, decency? Is it a faith problem? What do you think it is? I mean, because I look at stuff every day, and as a journalist, unfortunately, I have to watch the news and follow it. And it really makes me sad. I don't think there's a part of me that's been sadder in my life when I look at what's happening and I look at the immorality everywhere, including from the very top. And we all know what we're talking about, right? I mean, our leadership, I think, is an example of such lack of morality and lack of compassion and empathy. What's happening?
Well, it's a great question.
And you wrote hey, listen, let's mention you wrote a book that's called Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk, A Christian's Guide to Engaging Politics. So there was a reason why you wrote this book, but let's get to that. But tell me what your thoughts are on just that overall issue.
This is not meant to be a circuitous answer, but my answer is yes, and there's also hope. I think there is a degradation of morality. There's a degradation of compassion and empathy. And I think particularly in a culture, in our Western culture, that elevates the power of money, the power of me, myself, and I, after a while, we lose our sense of connection, belonging, connectedness with others, as long as I'm doing well.
Yep.
And so when you propagate that kind of mentality, not just for a year, but for years, for decades, for generations upon generations, after a while, it becomes systematized, institutionalized, and we swim in that very culture. So yes, I do believe. Now, for me, coming from a faith perspective, as a follower of Christ, as an imperfect, broken follower of Christ, and I'm not here to preach to any of your listeners, but from my perspective, yes, I do believe that faith in Christ, spirituality. But even if we're not necessarily followers of Jesus, this idea of loving God, but the second portion of the Great Commandments, to love our neighbors.
Right. Right.
That should be a universal mandate for all of us. It's what it means to be human, to be a good neighbor. And it is, in many religions, the idea of having compassion and care and empathy for neighbor is universal. Right. I think, though, the distinction, and this is why I'm fascinated and I'm compelled by the teachings of Jesus. So many of his parables, when he talks about loving our neighbor, he uses the example of the individual or groups of people that were not seen as neighbors during that time. Right. The Good Samaritan, as you know, is an example. And so for us to love our neighbors means that we're supposed to love everyone, yes, but especially those that don't look like us, think like us, feel like us, worship like us. And this might be hard, and this is hard for many of us. I'm just going to say it, even those that don't vote like us, because here are all the areas that are dividing our nation.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we should be soft on naming certain things. Like, we should be really clear and really compelling about saying emphatically, racism is wrong. We have no room and space for racism. But I do think that in our cancel culture, where we're so quick to just dismiss everyone, we need to have more genuine, this sounds overly idealistic, but I'm a big fan of the dining table. We need to have more meals together.
Yeah, that's true.
We need to have conversations together with each other, and the list goes on.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, in terms of trying to hear each other and trying to see each other, Christ's teachings he was all about going to the most marginalized people in society, right? And that's what we're not doing. I thought the silver lining of COVID-19 was going to be the building of empathy and compassion. And I was, we were all kind of saying that, oh, maybe this will make everyone realize that we're all the same and we need each other and, and we have to help each other. And then George Floyd happens. I mean, and everything just got jumbled. And so I do hope that, like you said, maybe we are going to hopefully see, that growth in compassion and understanding. But yeah, please.
Well, I think it's also just we have to remind ourselves that while there are challenging, painful, difficult stories of individuals that have been destructive, and simultaneously there are more stories of women, men, children of all backgrounds, of all ages, of all ethnic backgrounds that are also demonstrating empathy and compassion, justice and courage. And so I want to make sure that we're also giving the full scope of the story. And again, I think because our currency runs, I feel at times, I know you're a very well-known established journalist, and I'm not trying to just give a sweeping generalization of media, but sometimes I feel like our larger currency, our larger culture and media runs on the currency of fear and conflict.
Oh, I would not argue that at all.
Yeah. So we have to also make sure that we're also conveying, listening, celebrating even the smallest expressions.
Yeah.
This morning I heard stories of this massive peaceful parade / protest that was organized. It was spearheaded by 4 children, and tens of thousands of people showed up. And I don't take that lightly. I mean, I think these are stories. All of us by now, we're familiar with Mr. Rogers, and there's that folklore about telling kids who are afraid and anxious. When you're afraid and anxious, look for the helpers.
Yeah.
So that's good. I think it's really important. Let's look for the helpers, but beyond that, we can't just look for the helpers. To go back to the point that we made earlier, we have to be those very people that get off the sidelines and engage this particular movement.
That's right. That's right. We have to become the helpers as well. Okay, now you just, okay. So Pastor Cho, you're going to have to forgive me then, because you were talking about how the media sometimes does focus on the fear and the bad news, which, I'll admit it, that's what media tends to do. But I can't help but bring this up because it has to do with something really offensive to people who are believers and to the Christian faith, which is what President Trump recently did. He ordered a peaceful protest be dispersed with violence in order to do a photo op in front of a boarded up church holding a Bible in his hand. And as you know, people were up in arms about it, including faith leaders who were accusing him of using religion, using the Bible as a prop, when that was not, there was no sincerity behind it. I have to get your reaction on this first, as a faith leader.
That's my reaction.
Okay.
I'm speechless. I was speechless.
Weren't we all?
I'm not trying to be overly dramatic here. And, in my book, I talk about, as tough as this might be, and I get slammed by people on both sides because I think to some I'm too conservative, to others I'm too progressive. And I'm just trying to be faithful in the tension, to have integrity, to be faithful, to be true to some of the convictions that I have. And so in the book, I talk about the fact that I've made a commitment every single day to pray for my mayor of my city that I live in and to pray for the president of our country. I've done that now for many years for administrations past. I've had the privilege of meeting the previous president of the United States on a handful of occasions. And so I'm committed to it, but it is incredibly challenging. And when I say pray, I'm not speaking about soft prayers of adoration. I think part of what it means to pray for communities, for people, is that we're also holding them accountable to be firm. And so I think you saw that not just from the left, but I think you actually heard it from religious leaders from the right as well, who criticized that. And so that really encouraged me, that those who've been at times, often, typically attached at the hip to the current president, who've not said anything on previous situations, came out and said that was inappropriate, that was wrong. Not just the brandishing of the Bible for a photo op, but to take away an American right to be able to assemble peacefully and protest.
Right.
We're seeing crazy things all around the world right now, as you know. The situation in Hong Kong, for example, are things that we should be watching very carefully.
Definitely.
And so to see that take place for a photo op, I was speechless.
In America.
Was speechless. And so, I pray this and I say this as respectfully as I can. I pray that President Trump would grow in compassion, would grow in empathy, would learn to listen, and that in addition to just holding the Bible for a photo op, what's more important as a person of faith is, it's my prayer that you would deeply read that sacred text that means so much to Christians all around the world, particularly the conversation that you and I had about loving our neighbors, especially those who are marginalized and oppressed.
You are a better person than me, Pastor Cho, and that's why you're a pastor and I'm not, because I do not have that same reaction. I will openly admit it. I was stunned like you, and then I was so beyond angry, I didn't know what to do with myself. And again, as a person of faith, yes, I'm supposed to try to be a little bit more compassionate or understand, but I think it just pushed me over the edge. And I think that's why you saw even conservative faith leaders speak out, because I think that was just a step way too far. So again, from a faith perspective, and for those of us who want to, try to hold in our hearts, our faith and our, the teachings of Christ, or, whatever your spiritual belief is, or maybe not, you want to have compassion. But this is a very difficult moment in time for our country to try to deal with a divisive politics, but then from a faith perspective, try to hold on to that faith. So it's those conversations, I'm sure you're probably having quite often with people.
Yeah, we've heard the word unprecedented so many times ever since the pandemic, but who knew that, March or April would be like a cakewalk in comparison to what's going on. And I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but it has been some of the most tumultuous. I'm turning 50 this year. This is the most tumultuous stretch of time that I can recall. And yeah, we need deeper, wiser, compassionate leadership that's trying to bring people together. Now, I think there's that, and I'm not going to abdicate that responsibility just to that person, to the current president. I have to do my part. Yeah. I think all of us have to do our part in that. And one of the questions that I sometimes get from people is, how do you maintain hope in the middle of all of this?
Right.
And it's, I think we should just acknowledge it's hard. There are times I feel really frustrated, discouraged, disillusioned. I've been going for many walks. Pastoral confessions. There are times I have to binge watch some Korean drama just to kind of disconnect from things. That's a different episode. But two quotes have really encouraged me during this time, and I've been reading them constantly. I have them kind of on a little Post-it note on my monitor. One is from one of my favorite theologians. His name is Jürgen Moltmann, and he wrote a book called Theology of Hope. Okay. And in this book, he writes, genuine hope is not blind optimism. It is hope with open eyes, which sees the suffering and yet believes in the future.
Mm.
So I don't want a hope that's naive,
Yeah.
that's neglectful, that's detached. I want to see the suffering that goes on, including those that look like me, but also to those that don't look like me. But I also believe in the future. And as a person of faith, I believe that God isn't yet done, that this vision of restoration. The second quote that is also very impactful for me is one of my heroes, and it's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So many of his quotes are so inspiring.
Yes.
And I think we have to just note that he came from a faith perspective as a Christian. It's what formed his theology, the way that he lived, his activism. But his quote is, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice."
Yes.
And I think there are times many of us have said, how long? How long must we wait?
Yeah.
How long must we be in this state? Our Black and brown sisters and brothers have said, how long? How long for justice?
Yep.
How long for justice for Ahmaud Arbery, for Breonna Taylor, for Eric Garner, for Tamir Rice? And I say this quote, again, not to dismiss the sincerity and the vulnerability and the poignancy of that question, but I do want to give us some hope, is that it does bend toward justice. Yeah. And that's something for us to hang on to.
I think a lot of us are trying to hang on to that because sometimes we feel like we're going backwards. But again, maybe this moment is what's going to catapult us forward for good. All of us together, not just a section,
Absolutely.
A segment, which is what happened before. It was just segments and then it would go away, right? This time, maybe it's this greater movement that we're all part of. So let's hope. Let me ask you one final question, and this again has to do with faith in this time of turmoil and division. I think oftentimes I get very frustrated with those who say they have faith and those who claim to be such faithful followers, for us in Christianity. And I look at that because that's my faith. And I feel like there's no action though. They're hiding almost behind their faith. And they just sort of said, oh, well, God will take care of it. So I'm just going to sit here, inside my sanctuary or whatever. And
Sure.
There's no, I guess for the lack of a better word, sometimes I see a lack of courage, and Jesus was nothing like that. He was actually the polar opposite. He was the most courageous when he came, to be bold in, whatever he said, be bold in, what he meant, which was for the greater good. And oftentimes, he was the rebel, right?
Yeah.
He was rebellious.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
Where is that? What, because you are courageous, Pastor Cho, you do speak out when you see the wrongs and when you see injustice. And that's what I admire about faith leaders who are willing to do that. And I get very disappointed when I don't see that, because I think that's what we're missing. We're missing that faith and spirituality, that morality, that moral compass that often does come from faith leaders.
Right. Well, there's a few thoughts that are running through my head right now. There's, I think, two reasons why people, particularly of faith, choose not to engage. And I want to just kind of name it, acknowledge it, and explain it, and why I think it's dangerous.
Okay.
I think, for one, there are folks that choose to not engage for theological reasons. They believe that it's not their duty. They should just leave it to God. And as a result, I think it's a dangerous theology. In fact, I think it's a false theology. When we study scriptures, when we study the person and life and teachings of Jesus, I think it's very clear that Jesus didn't just teach from a pulpit and that was the totality of his ministry.
Right.
If anything, he was out and about.
Yes.
It wasn't just the teachings to massive groups. It was the organic, the personal. It was the meals. It was confronting justice. It was flipping tables. People will say, as Christians, that the most important thing is that we talk about the message of Jesus, that people become saved and they get to heaven. But I want to just point out that even in the last week of Jesus, Jesus doesn't go straight to the cross. It's not a point A to point B. In between, he confronts hypocrisy and injustice. He flips tables. He cures the sick and the blind. He feeds the poor. Yep. He has conversations. He has meals, and he washes the feet of his own disciples. It's not just heaven. It's about the kingdom of God here on this earth. I think the other reason why people don't engage, both faith and non-faith, is because we're afraid. We're just afraid. And I have a lot of compassion. And what I want to tell people is, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay, but that's not where we want to stay for the remainder of our lives. I'm afraid. I'm constantly afraid of the pushback, of the criticism, of losing my job. I mean, I'm afraid. All of us are afraid. Joshua chapter 1 in the Old Testament, and I'm going to ask your listeners to be kind and gracious. It's not my intent to preach a sermon here, but there's this redundancy in Joshua 1 where God tells Joshua again and again, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And it's almost like a broken record. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, why is it that God keeps repeating, don't be afraid, be brave, be courageous, to Joshua, who's well known in Christian history as this amazing, courageous general? And the only answer is, it's because Joshua was afraid. Yeah. Right. Several times, God has to keep reminding him. So if we're afraid, what I would tell people is join the club.
Yes, exactly.
We're all afraid.
We all are. Yeah.
We're all afraid, but that's the reason why it's not just up to you. It's not just up to me. We need a groundswell. We need more voices, more people, more letters, more calls, more generosity, more activism. And then after a while, you look around and you're like, I'm not singing alone.
Yes.
I'm in a choir of millions and millions of people who believe that racism is wrong, that the vilification, the demonization of immigrants, or the demonization of Hispanic and Black and brown people are wrong, that the xenophobia that exists, this is wrong.
Yes. Right.
That's what helps us with our courage.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a brilliant point, Pastor Cho, is that sometimes people are so afraid they don't want to speak up because they think they're alone, that they're the only one that's feeling this way. But when we speak up and share in our vulnerability, then you see, oh my gosh, there's so many people who feel the same way, and we can work together, to try to cure whatever this ailment is that we're going through.
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh. Pastor Cho, you know that I could speak to you for hours, because this was almost like, I actually got teary when you were speaking about the fear and what God said to Joshua, just because I think this is how we're all feeling right now. And we need those words of wisdom, wherever it comes from. It's got to help us build up that courage and have that hope, even in the darkness. Right.
And let's cheer each other on.
Yes.
I think that's the thing. We've got to keep cheering each other on. When we need to make corrections with each other, let's do it in love. Let's not slam and shame and use fear, but let's genuinely care for each other, that if we need to correct one another, we can do it in a spirit of love, but let's also spur and encourage each other on, because, you said it earlier, it's a marathon, and we need to be in it for the marathon.
Right. Right. We have to sustain it. Well, I think that's a great way to end this interview. And I know you were so tight on time. Everybody, you have to understand that Pastor Cho is extremely busy, and he has so much going on, and you're about to take on this new role, as you mentioned before. And the fact that you were able to squeeze in this interview, because I was begging you, because I really felt like we all need to hear from somebody who is courageous enough to speak boldly about what's going on in the world, but also from a higher perspective, that it's not just about us. There's a bigger thing out there that will help us get through. And we needed to hear that. Selfishly, I needed to hear it. I did.
It's really a joy and a pleasure to be able to connect with you again, and let's do it again.
I would love to.
Let's do that interview about the Korean drama when things are a little bit more, so.
I think that would be a really, really good, light-hearted interview to do. But Pastor Cho, please keep in touch because you do such tremendous work that I am so interested in on a personal level for me. So I want to continue to work with you, and if there's any way that I can help in terms of spreading the word about the work that you're doing or issues that we both care about, I definitely want to continue the conversation and use this platform in any way I can for the greater
Well, thank
good.
you. Yeah, thank you very much. I would just have one request. I would love your listeners to check out Bread for the World. It's bread.org. The activism that we do, the advocacy that we do right now, I can't tell you, I mean, the intensity of the work that we're doing behind the scenes with Congress, advocating for those who experience hunger and poverty, for children, for families that are on food stamps and SNAP programs. We're fighting for the next stimulus, probably the last COVID stimulus bill, to include $12 billion for international aid, because World Food Program has said that those who are going to experience acute hunger in the world are going to likely double by the end of this year. And so I would just love to encourage people to check out bread.org, learn more about, follow us, because we need your voice in that space as well.
Absolutely. We will definitely put that on the screen for everyone to check that out. But I'm so glad you mentioned that, and we'll encourage everyone to check it out and support it in any way they can. So, Pastor Cho, I just love what you do. I love the work that you're doing, and I'm behind you all the way. But thank you so much for spending time with us on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you, and likewise, and God bless you. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, for sure. That is exactly the kind of conversation I wanted to have at this time. And like I said to him, it was kind of for selfish reasons where I wanted to talk about things that were in my head and in my heart and my soul, and that I was conflicted with. So that really, I think it helps to just talk about these issues openly, not be afraid of judgment, not be afraid of criticism. And I'm sure I'm going to get criticism for this episode. There's so much, and people are so on edge about everything, and people are being critical, sensitive, judgmental, fearful. I have been saying, privately to people that I do have trolls on social media who will try to attack anything I say or do. And it's just the way it is right now, unfortunately. And I can't help but take it sometimes personally. And I do sometimes lash out, and that's probably not a good thing. But I wish, and this is a wish, of course, I wish people would calm down a little bit and listen. Try to listen and understand, maybe at least. You don't have to accept it as your own, but at least just try to understand and not have the knee-jerk reaction of just attacking. And again, I'm guilty of that, because when somebody's attacking me, my first reaction is to attack back. And that's something I have to work on too. But that all comes from, this heightened emotional state that we're all in. And that is what's leading to a lot of this violence and hatred and division. And we're never going to fix this problem until we do a little bit of self-assessment, ourselves, a little bit of soul searching, a bit of self-reflection. And sometimes that's really hard because you don't want to see that. You don't want to admit to the fact that you have this ugliness or hatred or spite, jealousy, envy, all of those things. And I know that I have that too. And I, on a daily basis, have to try to admit that and try to confront it. Sometimes I don't want to because I'm so pissed or, so annoyed. But it is a process. And I think that I really hope that this is the moment where we're all stopping and saying, boy, what am I doing to worsen the problem, what can I do to make it better? So it all starts with us individually. And then as Pastor Cho and I were saying, we're all afraid, but if we're all willing to admit that it's coming from fear or uncertainty or insecurity, worry, anxiety, we all have that, but it's okay. We can feel that we're human and we're going through some really crazy, screwed up times right now. So let's all just be willing to admit it, come together on these issues, and hopefully make that difference together. At least that's my hope, and I'm going to continue to do what I can. I'm going to just know that I will be criticized. I will be attacked, but I guess that's what courage is about, and being bold. So that's what I'm willing to do. Okay. Well, I hope you guys all are staying safe, and keep fighting the good fight in a peaceful way, in a productive way. We have to do this together. Okay. Until next time, take care.